A woman travels thousands of miles to marry a man she's never met, only to discover he's hiding a dangerous secret. When she uncovers the truth about his outlaw past, the local sheriff becomes her unexpected protector. This is a story about courage, in the face of deception, and finding honor where you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun bore down mercilessly as the stagecoach rattled into Copper Springs, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like desert spirits. Eleanor Blackwood clutched her leather-bound journal tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with anticipation. At 32, she had abandoned her life as a seamstress in Philadelphia, trading security for the promise of a new beginning in this frontier town. Through the soot-streaked window, Eleanor caught glimpses of the settlement. A church with a bell tower that leans slightly to one side, a general store with a faded wooden sign, and the Copper Canyon Saloon, where men in dusty hats lounged on the porch, eyeing the arriving stagecoach with idle curiosity. Copper Springs, end of the line. The driver called out, his voice rough from years of shouting over the rumble of wagon wheels. Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her grey traveling dress, tucking a stray strand of chestnut hair back into her sensible bun. Her stomach tightened with nerves as she gathered her carpet bag and the small wooden case containing her most precious possessions. Her mother's silver thimble, her father's pocket watch, and the letters from Robert Caldwell that had brought her to this distant place. Those letters, elegant in their penmanship, thoughtful in their content, had been her lifeline after her parents' passing, left her alone in Philadelphia with mounting debts and dwindling prospects. Robert had written of his successful ranch, his loneliness since returning from the war, and his desire for a mature, practical woman who could share his life. Their correspondence over 8 months had revealed a man who seemed intelligent, kind, and genuinely interested in her as a person, rather than merely a housekeeper or mother for future children. As Eleanor stepped down from the stagecoach, the heels of her boots sinking slightly into the dusty street, she scanned the gathered faces, searching for the man who matched the description in Robert's letters. Tall, with sandy brown hair and a trim moustache, blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Miss Blackwood, she turned, hope fluttering in her chest. A man approached, well-dressed in a dark suit that seemed too formal for the frontier setting. He was handsome in a sharp way, his features precisely arranged, his moustache neatly trimmed. He matched Robert's description, yet something about his smile didn't reach his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, extending her gloved hand. "Robert Caldwell, at your service." He took her hand, bowing slightly over it. "Welcome to Copper Springs. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" "It was long but uneventful," Eleanor replied, studying his face. "I'm pleased to finally meet you in person." Robert's eyes swept over her, assessment clear in his gaze. "You're exactly as you described yourself, refreshingly honest. Not many women would admit to being past 30 in their letters." Eleanor stiffened slightly at his tone, but forced a smile. "I believe honesty is essential, especially between future spouses." "Indeed," Robert agreed, offering his arm. "I've arranged a room for you at the hotel. We'll have dinner this evening and discuss our arrangements." As they walked the short distance to the Copper Springs Hotel, Eleanor noticed how people nodded respectfully to Robert, yet there was something in their expressions, a wariness perhaps, that gave her pause. The hotel was modest but clean, with a small lobby featuring well-worn furniture and faded floral wallpaper. The proprietress, Mrs. Daniels, a stout woman with graying hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, led Eleanor to a small room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6, she informed Eleanor, handing her the key. "Mr. Caldwell's arranged a private table." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, setting her bags down once alone. She unpacked methodically, arranging her few possessions on the dresser before retrieving Robert's letters from her carpet bag. Rereading them, she felt a twinge of uncertainty. The man who had greeted her seemed more calculating than the thoughtful correspondent who had written these warm words. Perhaps it was simply the awkwardness of a first meeting, or the fatigue of her journey coloring her perception. At precisely 6 o'clock, Eleanor descended to the hotel's dining room, where Robert awaited at a corner table. He rose as she approached, pulling out her chair with practiced courtesy. "You look well rested," he commented as she sat. "I've ordered the beef stew. It's the most reliable offering in this establishment." "Thank you," Eleanor said, though she would have preferred to make her own selection. "I'm eager to hear more about your ranch, Mr. Caldwell. In your letters, you mentioned it was 15 miles outside of town?" "Indeed, nearly 3,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory," Robert replied, his chest swelling visibly. "With pride. I've built it from nothing into the most successful operation in the county." "That's quite impressive," Eleanor said sincerely. "And you mentioned a library?" "I've brought a few of my favorite volumes, but I look forward to exploring yours." Robert's expression shifted slightly. "Well, I have some books, business volumes mostly, ledgers, that sort of thing." "Oh," Eleanor said, unable to hide her disappointment entirely. In his letters, he described shelves lined with the classics of literature and philosophy. Their meal arrived, a bowl of stew that proved tough and oversalted, and they ate in silence for several minutes. Eleanor was acutely aware of Robert studying her, his eyes moving from her face to her hands, which bore the small calluses of her years of seamstress work. "Tell me about your skills, Miss Blackwood," he said finally. "Your letters mentioned you were a seamstress of some repute in Philadelphia." "Yes, I apprenticed with Mrs. Holloway, one of the city's finest dressmakers, and eventually managed her shop," Eleanor explained, warming to the subject. "I specialized in intricate embroidery and beadwork for evening gowns. I've brought my needles and threads, though I imagine the styles here are more practical." "And your cooking?" "Household management," Robert pressed. "I lived alone after my parents passed, so I'm quite capable in the kitchen and with general household tasks," Eleanor assured him, "though I admit I'm more accomplished with a needle than a ladle." Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. "And what are your expectations of marriage, Miss Blackwood?" "I hope for partnership," she said honestly, "mutual respect, companionship. In your letters, you spoke of wanting someone who could help with the business aspects of your ranch as well as maintain a comfortable home." "Yes, well," Robert cleared his throat, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, "I may have overstated certain aspects. The truth is, Miss Blackwood, what I need is a practical woman, someone who understands her place, who can manage household affairs, and present herself appropriately as my wife." Eleanor felt as though the floor were dropping beneath her feet. "I don't understand. Your letters specifically mentioned—" "Letters can be misinterpreted," Robert interrupted, "or perhaps I wasn't clear enough about my requirements." "Requirements?" Eleanor repeated, her voice growing cold. Robert leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Copper Springs is a small community, Miss Blackwood. People talk. A man in my position needs a wife who enhances his standing, not one who might question his decisions or draw unnecessary attention to herself." "And what position is that exactly?" Eleanor asked, though she was beginning to suspect she'd made a terrible mistake in coming to Arizona. Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a businessman with important connections. The social aspects of marriage are as crucial as the practical ones. I need a wife who understands discretion and obedience." The word obedience hung in the air between them like a slap. Eleanor set down her spoon carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I see. Then I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding between us, Mr. Caldwell." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but not an insurmountable one. You're an intelligent, Woman, surely you understand that you have limited options. You've come all this way at considerable expense. Philadelphia is a long journey back, especially for a woman in your situation. The implication was clear. A spinster in her 30s, without family or fortune, had few prospects. He expected her to accept his terms out of desperation. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. "But I think we would both be better served by ending this arrangement before it begins." Robert's face darkened. "Don't be hasty, Miss Blackwood. I'm offering you security, respectability. What else do you have?" "My self-respect, for one," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." She turned and walked away, feeling his eyes burning into her back as she climbed the stairs to her room. Once inside, with the door firmly locked, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, her composure finally cracking. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. What now? She had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks of lodging, and then what? The return journey to Philadelphia would cost more than she possessed, and even if she could afford it, what awaited her there? No position, no home, no family. A knock at the door startled her. She quickly composed herself, smoothing her hair and dress before opening it a crack. Mrs. Daniels stood in the hallway, her round face creased with concern. "Everything all right, miss? Mr. Caldwell left in quite a state." "There's been a misunderstanding," Eleanor said carefully. "Mr. Caldwell and I will not be proceeding with our arrangement." The older woman's eyes widened. "Oh dear, that puts you in a pickle, doesn't it? Not many unmarried ladies in these parts without family." "I'll manage," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "Is there any work available in town? I'm a skilled seamstress, but I'm willing to consider other positions." Mrs. Daniels frowned thoughtfully. "Town's too small for a proper dressmaker. There's the saloon, but that's no place for a lady like yourself." She hesitated. "There might be something, though. Sheriff Mason was saying just yesterday he needs someone to help organize the town records and handle correspondence. His deputy used to do it, but he took a job with the railroad last month." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "That sounds promising. Could you introduce me to Sheriff Mason?" "First thing tomorrow," Mrs. Daniels promised. "For now, get some rest. Western men can be stubborn as mules, but they're not all cut from the same cloth as Robert Caldwell." After Mrs. Daniels left, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk and opened her journal, dipping her pen in ink. She'd always found clarity through writing. Copper Springs, Arizona Territory. June 8th, 1878, my new beginning has ended before it truly started. Robert Caldwell is not the man his letters portrayed. He seeks not a partner but a possession, not a companion but a subordinate. I refuse to diminish myself to satisfy his pride, yet what alternatives remain? My funds are limited, my prospects uncertain, but I cannot, will not, surrender the core of who I am, even in the face of practical necessity. Tomorrow I will meet with Sheriff Mason. Perhaps there lies an opportunity. She closed the journal and moved to the window, gazing. Out at the main street below, night had fallen, and Copper Springs' few buildings glowed with lamplight. Despite everything, the frontier landscape stirred something in her, a sense of openness, of possibility that Philadelphia, with all its established hierarchies, had never offered. As Eleanor prepared for bed, a commotion outside drew her back to the window. A group of men had gathered outside the saloon across the street. At their center stood Robert Caldwell, his face flushed with what she assumed was whiskey and wounded pride. His voice carried clearly through the night air. "Travel all this way for a wife, and what do I get? A spinster who thinks she knows better than her husband before the vows are even spoken." The men laughed and Eleanor closed the curtains, her jaw tight with anger and humiliation. Word would spread quickly in a town this size. By morning, everyone would know about the mail-order bride who had rejected Robert Caldwell. Sleep eluded her for hours as she pondered her situation. She had spent her life believing that her skills and practicality would be her salvation. Now it seemed they might be her downfall. Dawn was breaking when Eleanor finally drifted into restless sleep, one thought circling in her exhausted mind. What use were all her abilities if they left her stranded in a hostile wilderness with no path forward? Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Eleanor rose, washed at the small basin, and dressed in her best remaining outfit, a navy blue dress with subtle white piping that spoke of Eastern refinement without ostentation. She pinned her chestnut hair in a simple yet elegant style, determined to present herself as composed and capable despite the previous evening's humiliation. The hotel dining room was half full when she descended, and Eleanor braced herself for whispers and stares. To her surprise, the few early risers barely glanced her way, more interested in their coffee and breakfast than in the newest scandal. Mrs. Daniels bustled over, setting down a plate of eggs and biscuits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eat up, dear. We'll see Sheriff Mason at 8 o'clock. His office is just down the street next to the telegraph office. Eleanor nodded gratefully. Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Daniels. Nonsense, the older woman said with a wave of her hand. Caldwell thinks too highly of himself. His last potential bride left on the same stagecoach that brought her. This revelation surprised Eleanor. I wasn't the first. Third, by my count, Mrs. Daniels confided, lowering her voice. The first was too young and frightened of her own shadow. The second asked too many questions about his business dealings. Neither suited his requirements. She pronounced the last word with undisguised distaste. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mrs. Daniels led Eleanor to a well-maintained building, with a sign reading, Sheriff's Office, Copper Springs. The American flag flew from a pole beside the door, moving gently in the morning breeze. The sheriff himself answered their knock. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with sandy hair streaked with silver at the temples and a neatly trimmed beard. Sheriff Nathaniel Mason's weathered face spoke of years under the Arizona sun, but his hazel eyes were alert and intelligent beneath the brim of his hat. Mrs. Daniels, he greeted warmly, then turned curious eyes to Eleanor. And who might this be? Sheriff Mason, this is Miss Eleanor Blackwood from Philadelphia. She's a skilled seamstress looking for employment, and I remembered you mentioning needing help with your records and correspondence. Mason's eyebrows rose with interest. Indeed. Please come in, ladies. The sheriff's office was surprisingly orderly compared to the other establishments Eleanor had seen in Copper Springs. Large desk dominated the front room, with wanted posters carefully tacked to one wall and a gun rack secured behind the desk. Through an open door, she glimpsed 2 cells with iron bars, empty at present, and a small back room with filing cabinets and a second, smaller desk. You're looking for work, Miss Blackwood? Sheriff Mason asked as they settled into chairs. Opposite his desk. Yes, Eleanor replied, steadying her voice. I find myself in need of employment sooner than expected. The sheriff nodded, his expression suggesting he'd already heard about her situation with Caldwell. Mrs. Daniels mentioned you're a seamstress? I am, though I understand Copper Springs may not need such services, Eleanor explained. However, I also have experience managing a shop, keeping accounts, and handling correspondence. I write with a clear hand and can maintain organized records. Mason leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. As it happens, I do need someone with exactly those skills. The town council recently allocated funds for a proper clerk to organize our records. Copper Springs is growing, and the paperwork. It grows with it. Land deeds, business licenses, arrest records, court proceedings. He gestured to the back room. Deputy Williams used to handle it, but he's moved on to the railroad. It's become something of a mess. Hope bloomed in Eleanor's chest. I would be very interested in such a position, Sheriff. It's not glamorous work, Mason warned, and some folks might find it unusual for a woman to be working at the sheriff's office. I'm well acquainted with managing unconventional situations, Eleanor replied with a small smile. In Philadelphia, I ran a dressmaking shop after my employer fell ill. Some clients were initially reluctant to discuss business with a mere seamstress, but they came to respect competence, regardless of gender. A glimmer of approval flickered in Mason's eyes. Well said, Miss Blackwood. Would you like to see what you'd be dealing with? He led her to the back room, where stacks of papers and files covered every surface. Ledgers with pages sticking out haphazardly were piled in corners, and correspondence spilled from overstuffed drawers. Williams meant well, but organization wasn't his strength, Mason explained, looking somewhat embarrassed by the chaos. Rather than being discouraged, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was a challenge she could tackle, something concrete and useful that would occupy her mind while she determined her next steps. I can bring order to this, she stated confidently. With a proper filing system and consistent procedure, these records could become a valuable resource rather than a burden. Sheriff Mason's expression brightened. That's exactly what I need to hear. The position pays $30 a month. Not a fortune, I know, but it includes a small room behind. The office that the previous deputy used. It's modest but private, with its own entrance from the side alley. Mrs. Eleanor calculated quickly. The salary was less than she'd earned in Philadelphia, but with lodging included, it would allow her to save toward either establishing herself permanently in Copper Springs or eventually returning east. When would you like me to start? She asked. Is tomorrow too soon? Mason replied with a relieved smile. They settled the details, and as Eleanor prepared to leave, the sheriff added, One more thing, Miss Blackwood. Robert Caldwell is an influential man in this town. He won't take kindly to you working for me. May I ask why? Mason's expression grew guarded. Let's just say we have different views on how things should be run in Copper Springs. If working for me will cause you additional difficulty. Sheriff Mason, Eleanor interrupted gently, I made my decision about Mr. Caldwell last night. I'm prepared to face the consequences of that choice. He nodded, respect evident in his gaze. Then I'll see you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp. As Eleanor and Mrs. Daniels walked back toward the hotel, the older woman beamed. That went even better than I'd hoped. The sheriff's a good man, fair-minded, unlike some in this town. Do you know why there's tension between him and Mr. Caldwell? Eleanor asked. Mrs. Daniels glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Caldwell arrived about 3 years ago, bought the largest ranch in the territory, and started making improvements to Copper Springs, mostly ones that lined his pockets. Sheriff Mason enforces the law equally for everyone, which Caldwell finds inconvenient for his business interests. She paused. There are rumors about how Caldwell acquired his wealth so quickly, but nothing has been proven. This information added to Eleanor's unease about her almost husband, but also reinforced her relief at discovering his true nature before marrying him. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day writing letters, one to her former landlady in Philadelphia, explaining her change in circumstances, and another to her closest friend, Sarah, who had warned her about the risks of becoming a mail-order bride. She didn't mention the full extent of Robert Caldwell's coldness, not wanting to worry Sarah, but she did share her new position with the sheriff's office. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the sheriff's office promptly at 8, carrying her carpet bag with her personal possessions. Sheriff Mason showed her to the small room that would be her new home, basic but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, small wardrobe, and a window that looked out on the side alley. A quilt in a simple pattern brightened the otherwise plain space. Mrs. Daniels sent this over, Mason explained, nodding to the quilt. Said every home needs a woman's touch, even a temporary one. Eleanor was touched by the gesture, Please thank her for me." After settling her few belongings, Eleanor rolled up her sleeves, both literally and figuratively, and began assessing the record situation. By midday, she had established categories for the different types of documents and created a plan for organizing them. Sheriff Mason, who had been out on his morning rounds, returned to find her surrounded by neatly sorted piles. "You've made more progress in a few hours than Williams did in months," he remarked, clearly impressed. "I've only just begun," Eleanor replied. "A proper system will take time to implement, but it will save countless hours once in place." She hesitated, then added, "I noticed several land transaction records involving Mr. Caldwell appear to be missing key signatures or witnesses. Is that typical in territorial law?" Something flickered in Mason's eyes. Concern, perhaps, or confirmation. Of suspicion. "No, it's not. Those are exactly the sort of irregularities I've been trying to document." Before they could discuss further, the door opened and a young boy of about 12 burst in, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff, there's a fight at Sullivan's place. Mr. Peterson and some ranchers are about to shoot each other." Mason grabbed his hat. "Duty calls, Miss Blackwood. Continue with your organization. We'll discuss those records when I return." Left. Alone, Eleanor worked steadily through the afternoon, pausing only when her growling stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Deciding to fetch a quick lunch from the hotel, she stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine. As she crossed the street, Eleanor became aware of whispers and stares from the townsfolk. The privacy she'd experienced that morning had evaporated. She held her head high, refusing to be cowed by their curiosity or judgment. At the hotel, Mrs. Daniels hurried over. "How's the new position?" she asked, setting a plate of cold chicken and bread before Eleanor. "Challenging but satisfying," Eleanor replied. "There's much to organize, but Sheriff Mason seems appreciative of my efforts." Mrs. Daniels lowered her voice. "You should know that Robert Caldwell was in here earlier, asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you'd left town yet." Eleanor's appetite diminished. "What did you tell him?" "That your arrangements were your own business," Mrs. Daniels said firmly. But he didn't like that answer. "Be careful, dear. Caldwell doesn't take rejection well, especially from those he considers beneath him." Returning to the sheriff's office, Eleanor was so preoccupied with thoughts of Caldwell that she nearly collided with a man exiting the building. She stepped back with an apology, then froze as she recognized him, not from having met him before, but from a wanted poster she'd seen while organizing the sheriff's records. The man was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to assess everything in their path. A scar ran along his jawline, and though he wore ordinary rancher's clothing, something in his posture spoke of danger barely contained. He tipped his hat to her with exaggerated courtesy, a sardonic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ma'am," he drawled before continuing down the street. Inside, Sheriff Mason was reviewing papers at his desk, his expression troubled. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, closing the door behind her, "that man who just left, isn't he wanted in Colorado for stagecoach robbery?" Mason looked up sharply. "You recognize Daniel Hargrove?" "I saw his poster while organizing the files," she explained. "Shouldn't you have arrested him?" The sheriff sighed, rubbing his beard. "It's complicated, Miss Blackwood. Hargrove is indeed wanted in Colorado, but not in Arizona territory, at least not yet. He works for Robert Caldwell now, and Caldwell insists Hargrove has been falsely accused." "You don't believe that?" Eleanor observed. "No, I don't," Mason admitted, "but I need evidence of wrongdoing in my jurisdiction before I can act. Hargrove knows it too. He makes a point of visiting my office regularly, his way of thumbing his nose at the law." Eleanor recalled the missing signatures on Caldwell's land transactions. "Is it possible Mr. Caldwell employs him for more than ranch work?" Mason studied her with new interest. "You have good instincts, Miss Blackwood. I've had similar thoughts. Caldwell has acquired property at an unusual rate since arriving in Copper Springs, and Hargrove's arrival coincided with reports of mysterious accidents befalling landowners who refused to sell. "That sounds like intimidation," Eleanor said. "It does, but proving it is another matter. The victims either can't identify their attackers or mysteriously change their stories after visits from Caldwell." Mason leaned forward. "Which brings me to something I need to discuss with you. The records you're organizing, they may contain evidence of Caldwell's illegal activities. By working here, you could become entangled in a dangerous situation." Eleanor considered this. "Are you suggesting I should seek employment elsewhere?" "No," Mason replied quickly. "You're already proving invaluable. I'm simply ensuring you understand the potential risks. Caldwell won't be pleased to learn you're working for me, especially if you're helping organize evidence that might eventually be used against him." Eleanor thought of the cold calculation in Robert Caldwell's eyes, the hint of cruelty beneath his polished veneer. She thought, too, of the genuine concern in Sheriff Mason's expression and the satisfaction she'd felt bringing order to chaos. "I appreciate your candor, Sheriff," she said finally, "but I won't be intimidated. If Mr. Caldwell is operating outside the law, perhaps my organizational skills can help bring that to light." Mason's expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're braver than most men who've passed through that door, Miss Blackwood. Just promise me you'll be careful. Caldwell has eyes all over town, and he doesn't take kindly to perceived interference." "I will," Eleanor promised. "And perhaps we should be more discreet about the land transaction records I mentioned." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "Let's keep those in a separate location. There's a lockbox in my quarters that would be suitable." As they discussed security measures for sensitive documents, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Eleanor saw Robert Caldwell dismounting from an expensive black horse, flanked by Daniel Hargrove and another rough-looking man she didn't recognize. "It seems Mr. Caldwell has discovered your new employment sooner than expected," Mason observed grimly, moving to stand protectively between Eleanor and the door. Eleanor smoothed her skirts and straightened her spine, preparing to face the man she'd traveled across the country to marry, now transformed into a potential threat. "Let him come, Sheriff. I have nothing to hide." As Caldwell's boots sounded on the wooden steps outside, Eleanor felt an unexpected calm settle over her. For the first time since arriving in Copper Springs, she had found solid ground beneath her feet, not in the false promises of a husband, but in meaningful work and an ally who respected her abilities. The door swung open, and Robert Caldwell filled the frame, his cold eyes finding Eleanor immediately. "Well," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "it seems the mail-order bride has found herself a new position. How convenient for everyone involved." Sheriff Mason's hand moved casually to rest near his holstered gun. "Mr. Caldwell, what brings you to my office today?" "Just checking on the welfare of my almost bride," Caldwell replied with mock concern. "After all, I feel somewhat responsible for her predicament." "Miss Blackwood is now employed by the town of Copper Springs," Mason stated firmly. "Her welfare is no longer your concern." Caldwell's smile never reached his eyes. "Everything in Copper Springs is my concern, Sheriff. I would have thought our previous discussions made that perfectly clear." The tension in the room grew palpable. As the two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down, Eleanor realized she was witnessing more than a disagreement. This was a battle for the soul of Copper Springs itself, and somehow she had landed squarely in the middle of it. The standoff between Sheriff Mason and Robert Caldwell lasted several tense moments before Caldwell broke the silence with a cold laugh. "Now, Sheriff, there's no need for hostility," he said, gesturing to Mason's hand hovering near his gun. "I merely wanted to personally congratulate Miss Blackwood on her new position. Not many women would show such initiative after traveling so far for a marriage that didn't materialize." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Caldwell, but as Sheriff Mason said, my employment is a matter between myself and the town council." "The town council which I happen to chair," Caldwell reminded her, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I don't recall approving the hiring of a new clerk." "The position and funding were approved last month," Mason countered. "The selection of candidates was left to my discretion." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, how fortunate that a qualified candidate arrived on the very stagecoach I paid for." He turned to Eleanor, his expression shifting to one of concern that didn't reach his eyes. "I do hope you understand, Miss Blackwood, that working for the sheriff might create certain difficulties for you in Copper Springs. Many residents are traditional in their views about a woman's proper place." "I've never been particularly concerned with adhering to others' expectations of propriety, Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor replied steadily, "especially when those expectations conflict with necessity or principle." Something dangerous flickered in Caldwell's eyes before his mask of civility returned. "Principles are luxuries, Miss Blackwood, particularly on the frontier. I hope you won't find that lesson too costly." The threat beneath his polite words was unmistakable. Sheriff Mason stepped forward, physically inserting himself between Eleanor and Caldwell. "If that's all, Mr. Caldwell, Miss Blackwood and I have work to attend to, town business." Caldwell smiled thinly. "Of course, Sheriff. Don't let me keep you from your filing." He tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, my offer remains open should you reconsider your options. The journey east is expensive, after all." After Caldwell departed, Eleanor released a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. Mason closed the door firmly, then turned to her with concern, etched on his weathered face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she replied, though her hands trembled slightly. "He's not accustomed to being refused, is he?" "No," Mason agreed grimly. "Caldwell has built his empire on people saying yes out of either greed or fear. Your rejection stings his pride, and now you're aligned with the one man in Copper Springs who actively questions his methods." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Then it's fortunate I've found employment with that particular man, isn't it?" A hint of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Fortunate for the sheriff's office, certainly. Those records haven't seen such attention since they were created." His expression grew serious again. "But Caldwell's visit confirms my concerns. He'll be watching you closely, looking for ways to pressure or discredit you." "Let him watch," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "I have nothing to hide." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Eleanor established herself in her new role. Each morning she rose early, made herself presentable, and worked methodically through the chaotic backlog of paperwork accumulated during Deputy Williams' tenure and before. She created a logical filing system, transcribed handwritten notes into clear records, and developed a straightforward procedure for tracking new documents. Sheriff Mason observed her progress with evident appreciation. Unlike Caldwell, who had assessed her with cold calculation, Mason saw her as a capable colleague whose skills complemented his own. He began consulting her on administrative matters, valuing her organizational mind and attention to detail. Eleanor quickly learned the rhythm of the sheriff's office. Mornings were typically quiet. Afternoons brought minor disturbances from the saloon or disputes between townspeople, and evenings occasionally erupted into more serious situations requiring Mason's intervention. During one such evening, while Mason was handling a dispute at the Copper Canyon saloon, Eleanor discovered a pattern in the land records that confirmed her earlier suspicions. Several properties acquired by Caldwell showed the same irregularities, missing signatures, incomplete documentation, or witnesses whose names appeared repeatedly yet were unknown to current residents. She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear the door open. A deep voice startled her. "Working late, Miss Blackwood?" Eleanor looked up to find Daniel Hargrove leaning against the doorframe, watching her with unsettling intensity. Instinctively, she shifted the papers to conceal what she'd been examining. "Mr. Hargrove, what brings you to the sheriff's office at this hour?" "Just passing by," he drawled, stepping into the room uninvited. "Saw the lamp burning. Curious what keeps a lady working after dark." His eyes flicked to the papers on her desk. "Must be mighty important records." Eleanor maintained her composure despite her racing heart. "Simply fulfilling my duties. Sheriff Mason expects organization, and I intend to provide it." Hargrove moved closer, his movements casual yet somehow threatening. "Caldwell's mighty interested in your duties here. Seems peculiar to him that you'd choose working for the sheriff over the comforts he offered." "There was nothing peculiar about my decision," Eleanor replied coldly. "Mr. Caldwell and I discovered we had incompatible expectations." A smile played at the corners of Hargrove's mouth. "That's so? Well, Caldwell ain't accustomed to people choosing principles over profit. Makes him suspicious." "I'm not responsible for Mr. Caldwell's suspicions or his wounded pride," Eleanor stated, standing to signal the conversation was over. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to lock up the office." Hargrove didn't move. "Caldwell thinks you might be helping Mason build a case against him. Says a woman scorned is dangerous, especially one with access to sensitive documents." Fear flickered through Eleanor, but she refused to show it. "Mr. Caldwell overestimates both my capacity for vengeance and his own importance. I'm simply doing the job I was hired to do." Hargrove studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Maybe so, but if I were you, I'd be careful what threads I pulled. Some leads ain't meant to be followed, not if you value your safety." He tipped his hat. "Evening, Miss Blackwood. Sleep well." After he left, Eleanor locked the door with trembling hands. She gathered the documents she'd been examining and hid them in the secret compartment Mason had shown her, then extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, she tried to calm her racing heart, recognizing that her position had suddenly become far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. The next morning, she reported the encounter to Sheriff Mason, who listened with increasing concern. "Hargrove, we're sending a clear message from Caldwell," he concluded. "They're worried about what you might find in these records." "Which suggests there's something to find," Eleanor pointed out. "The pattern I discovered last night, properties changing hands after accidents befell their owners, it's too consistent to be coincidence." Mason nodded grimly. "I've suspected as much, but proving it requires documentation that connects Caldwell directly to the intimidation. The land transfer for the Peterson property is particularly suspicious," Eleanor continued. "According to these records, Mr. Peterson sold his ranch to Caldwell for a fraction of its value just 3 days after his barn mysteriously burned down. The witness signatures include Daniel Hargrove and someone named James Lynch." "Lynch?" Mason's eyebrows rose. "He was Hargrove's partner in the Colorado robbery. He's wanted in 3 territories." Eleanor felt a chill. So Caldwell is employing not 1, but 2 known outlaws, and they're witnessing his land acquisitions. Surely that's evidence of wrongdoing? "Circumstantial," Mason said, frustration evident in his voice. "We need someone to testify about the intimidation tactics. Without that, it's just suspicious paperwork." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a weathered rancher whom Mason greeted as Frank Sullivan. The man's leathery face was etched with worry lines, and his hands, calloused from years of hard work, twisted his hat nervously. "Sheriff, got a problem out at my place. Someone cut my fence line last night, drove off 30 head of cattle. Tracked him a ways before the trail disappeared near Caldwell's north pasture." Mason's expression darkened. "This is the 3rd incident this month. Did you see anyone?" Sullivan shook his head. "No, but my boy Thomas heard riders after midnight. Said there were at least 3 of them moving fast. I'll ride out and have a look, Mason promised. "In the meantime, warn the other small ranchers to keep watch. Whoever's doing this is getting bolder." After Sullivan left, Mason began checking his gun and gathering supplies for the ride to the ranch. Eleanor watched him, noting the grim determination in his movements. "You believe Caldwell is behind the cattle rustling," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Mason confirmed. "It's another form of pressure on the smaller ranchers. Steal enough of their livelihood, and they'll eventually sell to the one man who can offer immediate cash, Caldwell." It's a calculated campaign, Eleanor realized. The intimidation, the accidents, now theft, all designed to force people off their land without direct evidence pointing back to him. Mason nodded, buckling on his gun belt. "Exactly, and he's been remarkably successful. In 3 years, he's acquired more land than most ranchers manage in a lifetime. Is it safe for you to go alone?" Eleanor asked, concerned by the deepening danger. "Frank will meet me at his ranch with his sons," Mason assured her. "I should be back by nightfall. Lock the office when you leave, and be careful walking back to your room. After Hargrove's visit last night, I'd prefer you didn't take unnecessary risks." After Mason departed, Eleanor continued working through the property records, documenting each irregularity she discovered. By mid-afternoon, she had compiled substantial evidence of Caldwell's suspicious acquisitions, though, as Mason had noted, it remained circumstantial without testimony about the intimidation tactics. As she was organizing her findings, the office door opened, and Mrs. Daniels entered carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh bread and preserves," the older woman said, setting the basket on a corner of the desk. "You've been working so hard, I rarely see you at mealtimes anymore." "That's very kind of you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. Mrs. Daniels lowered her voice, though they were alone in the office. "There's talk around town. Caldwell's been asking questions about you and the sheriff, implying there might be impropriety in your working arrangement." Eleanor's cheeks flushed with indignation. "That's absurd. Sheriff Mason has been nothing but professional and respectful." "I know that, dear," Mrs. Daniels soothed, "but Caldwell's planting seeds of doubt. He's quite skilled at turning public opinion when it suits his purposes." The strategy was as insidious as it was effective, undermining Eleanor's position by questioning her virtue and Mason's integrity. It was a familiar tactic, one that had forced many capable women to retreat from public roles throughout history. "I won't be intimidated by gossip," Eleanor stated firmly. Mrs. Daniels patted her hand. "Good girl. Just be prepared for cold shoulders from some of the more respectable ladies in town. Caldwell's wife, Abigail, holds considerable sway among the church circle." This was the first Eleanor had heard of Caldwell being married. "His wife? He never mentioned a wife in his letters." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Daniels confirmed, her eyes widening. "Abigail Caldwell lives mainly in Denver, managing their social affairs there. She visits Copper Springs occasionally, usually when Robert requires her presence for some business function." She lowered her voice further. "Their marriage is one of convenience, from what I gather. She has family connections he needed, and she enjoys the wealth he provides." The revelation that Caldwell had been corresponding with Eleanor while married added another layer to his deception. No wonder he had expected unquestioning obedience from his mail-order bride. He was accustomed to a marriage based on transaction rather than partnership. After Mrs. Daniels departed, Eleanor tried to refocus on her work, but found her mind returning to this new information about Caldwell. His willingness to enter into a fraudulent marriage with her while already wed suggested a man who viewed people as merely pieces to be moved in his larger game of acquisition and control. As evening approached with no sign of Sheriff Mason returning, Eleanor became increasingly uneasy. She completed her day's work, carefully secured the sensitive documents, and locked the office before walking the short distance to her small room at the rear of the building. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she sensed someone watching. Her! Glancing around the quiet street, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the shadows between buildings, but when she looked more directly, no one was there. Quickening her pace, Eleanor reached her door, unlocked it swiftly and stepped inside, securing the deadbolt behind her. Her small quarters felt particularly vulnerable tonight. She checked the window latch twice before lighting a lamp and pulling. The curtains closed. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the distant piano music from the saloon and occasional bursts of laughter from cowboys enjoying an evening's entertainment. Eleanor tried to calm her nerves by writing in her journal, documenting her discoveries and suspicions about Caldwell. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record of what she had uncovered. As she wrote, a phrase Hargrove had used echoed in her mind. Some leads ain't meant to be followed, not if you value your safety. The threat had been clear, yet it only strengthened her resolve to continue her work with Mason. If Caldwell and his men were this concerned about what she might find, she must be on the right track. A sharp knock at her door startled Eleanor from her thoughts. She froze, pen poised above the page, listening intently. The knock came again, more urgent this time. "Miss Blackwood?" A female voice called softly. "Please, I need your help." Eleanor approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" "Mary Sullivan, Frank Sullivan's wife. Please, it's about the sheriff. He's been hurt." Eleanor's heart lurched. She unbolted the door and opened it to find a middle-aged woman with a careworn face, her eyes wide with distress. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, reaching for her shawl. "There was an ambush at our ranch," Mrs. Sullivan explained, her voice trembling. 3 masked men. They shot at the sheriff and Frank. My boys brought Sheriff Mason to our home, but he needs proper care. Frank sent me to fetch you since the doctor's away in Prescott." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. If Mason was injured, he would need help, and she had assisted the Philadelphia doctor often enough to have basic medical knowledge. Yet something about the situation felt wrong. Why send Mrs. Sullivan alone at night rather than one of the Sullivan sons? "Let me gather some supplies from the sheriff's office," Eleanor said, deciding to trust her instincts. "He keeps a medical kit there." As she stepped toward the office door, Mrs. Sullivan grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "No time. We have supplies at the ranch. Please, he's losing blood." The grip on her arm tightened painfully, and Eleanor noticed calluses inconsistent with a rancher's wife who would primarily do household work. Looking more closely at Mrs. Sullivan in the dim light, she realized she had never actually met Frank Sullivan's wife before. This woman was a stranger to her. "You're not Mary Sullivan," Eleanor said, attempting to pull away. The woman's expression hardened. "Smart girl, too smart for your own good." Before Eleanor could react, a cloth pressed against her face from behind. Someone had entered through her window while she was distracted by the visitor. The sickly sweet smell of chloroform filled her nostrils as she struggled briefly before darkness claimed her consciousness. Her last coherent thought was of Sheriff Mason. Was he truly injured, or had that been part of the deception to lure her away? Either way, she had walked directly into Caldwell's trap, just as he had planned. Consciousness returned to Eleanor. Slowly, her head pounding as the effects of the chloroform faded. She kept her eyes closed, fighting the urge to panic as she tried to assess her situation through her other senses. She was lying on something hard and uneven, a wooden floor. The air smelled of dust, pine, and kerosene. Somewhere nearby, men's voices murmured in conversation. "Shouldn't have used so much chloroform. You could have killed her," one voice said, its tone educated, controlled. "Caldwell?" She struggled, another replied defensively. The voice of the woman who had impersonated Mrs. Sullivan, now clearly a man speaking in his natural register. Couldn't risk her screaming and alerting someone. Doesn't matter now, a third voice interjected, Hargrove's distinctive drawl. Question is, what do we do with her? Mason will tear this territory apart looking for her. Mason is occupied with his own problems, Caldwell replied coolly. The diversion at Sullivan's ranch should keep him busy through tomorrow at least. Eleanor's heart sank. So there had been an attack at the ranch, not entirely a fabrication, but a planned distraction to separate her from the sheriff's protection. When she wakes up, Caldwell continued, she'll tell us exactly what she found in those records, what she shared with Mason, and who else knows. Then we'll decide her fate. The calculating coldness of his voice sent a chill through Eleanor. She forced herself to remain still, breathing evenly, while she continued gathering information. From the echo of their voices, she guessed they were in a cabin or small structure. A slight draft suggested it wasn't well maintained. The distant sound of water, perhaps a creek or river, provided the only clue to their location. She's awake, Hargrove suddenly announced. Breathing changed. Ain't her first time playing possum, I'd wager. Eleanor opened her eyes, knowing further pretense was useless. She found herself in a crude cabin with a single room. A kerosene lamp on a rough-hewn table cast long shadows across the space. 3 men watched her, Caldwell, Hargrove, and a burly stranger she assumed was the man who had disguised himself as Mrs. Sullivan. Her hands were bound in front of her with rope, though her feet remained free. Miss Blackwood, Caldwell greeted her as if they were meeting at a social function rather than in a kidnapping situation. I apologize for the dramatic means of bringing you here, but I required a private conversation away from the sheriff's influence. Eleanor pushed herself to a sitting position, ignoring the throbbing in her head. Most people simply request an appointment, Mr. Caldwell. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Your spirit remains intact, I see. Good. This will be simpler if you're rational. There's nothing rational about abduction, Eleanor countered, glancing around for anything that might serve as a weapon or means of escape. The cabin had one door, 2 small windows and sparse furnishings, the table, 3 chairs, and what appeared to be a storage trunk. Perhaps not, Caldwell conceded, but necessary given the circumstances. You've been examining records that contain sensitive information about my business dealings. It wasn't a question. I've been organizing the sheriff's files, as is my job. Eleanor replied carefully. Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's not waste time with denials. I know you've uncovered irregularities in land transactions. I know you've documented a pattern that, in the wrong hands, could prove problematic for my interests in Copper Springs. If your business dealings are legitimate, Mr. Caldwell, why would organizing public records pose any threat? Eleanor challenged. Hargrove snorted, but Caldwell silenced him with a look before turning back to Eleanor. Business in the territories requires flexibility, Miss Blackwood. Eastern sensibilities about property rights don't always apply in places still being civilized. He paced before her, hands clasped behind his back. I'm building something significant here, bringing progress, investment, stability. The means may occasionally be unorthodox, but the end justifies them. Unorthodox? Eleanor repeated incredulously. Is that what you call intimidation, theft, and fraud? Caldwell's expression hardened. Enough posturing. Here's what will happen. You will tell me exactly what you found, what documentation you've compiled, and where it's currently located. In exchange, I'll ensure you leave Arizona territory safely, with sufficient funds to establish yourself elsewhere. The offer was clear. Her life in exchange for betraying Sheriff Mason and abandoning her principles. Eleanor met Caldwell's gaze steadily. And if I refuse, then I'll be forced to conclude you're irredeemably aligned with the sheriff against me, Caldwell replied, his voice softening dangerously. "In which case, this cabin is very remote, and accidents are common in the wilderness." Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral, despite the fear tightening her chest. "Sheriff Mason knows I was investigating your land acquisitions. If I disappear, he'll have even more reason to scrutinize your activities." "A valid concern," Caldwell acknowledged, "which is why I've prepared an alternative. Your journal, quite detailed about your disillusionment with frontier life and your plans to return east, will be found near Bright Angel Trail, along with some personal effects. A tragic misstep while traveling alone, such a common fate for Easterners unaccustomed to our terrain." The coldly calculated plan revealed the true extent of Caldwell's ruthlessness. He'd entered her room not just to kidnap her, but to search her belongings and read her private thoughts, gathering material to fabricate her disappearance. "You won't succeed," Eleanor stated with more confidence than she felt. "Sheriff Mason won't believe I would leave without notice, especially not after the progress we've made investigating you." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Investigating me? So you admit it?" Eleanor realized her error too late. In her determination to stand firm, she'd confirmed precisely what Caldwell wanted to know, that she and Mason were actively building a case against him, not merely organizing records. "How far along is this investigation?" Caldwell pressed, sensing her vulnerability. "What evidence have you gathered? Who else is involved?" Before Eleanor could formulate a response that wouldn't further compromise her position, the cabin door burst open. A rain-soaked man stumbled in, his expression urgent. "Riders coming," he gasped between breaths. "5, maybe 6, armed." Hargrove moved to the window, peering cautiously through the grimy glass. "Can't see clearly in this rain, but someone's definitely approaching." "Mason!" Caldwell demanded. "Don't think so," the newcomer replied. "Coming from the wrong direction." Caldwell's mind worked quickly, reassessing the situation. "Hargrove, take her to the back trail. Get to the secondary location. We'll meet you there once we've dealt with these visitors." Hargrove grabbed Eleanor's arm, hauling her to her feet. "Move," he ordered, pulling her toward a small door at the rear of the cabin she hadn't noticed before. "What about the record she's been assembling?" the burly man asked Caldwell. "She'll tell us everything at the new location," Caldwell replied coldly. "One way or another." As Hargrove dragged her toward the back door, Eleanor's mind raced. If she left with him now, her chances of survival would diminish significantly. The approaching riders, whoever they were, represented her best hope for escape, or at least for alerting someone to her plight. When Hargrove paused to open the door, Eleanor acted on instinct. She drove her elbow hard into his midsection, just below his ribs. The outlaw doubled over with a grunt of pain, his grip on her arm loosening just enough for her to wrench free. In the same motion, she grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table and hurled it against the wall. The lamp shattered, spraying flaming oil across the dry wooden planks. Fire bloomed instantly, spreading along the wall with frightening speed. "You crazy woman!" Hargrove shouted, lunging for her as the other men scrambled to respond to the fire. Eleanor dodged, making for the front door. Caldwell intercepted her, his face contorted with rage. "Stop her!" he commanded as Eleanor slipped past him, her bound, hands hampering her but not enough to prevent her escape. She burst through the front door, into the pouring rain, the sudden downpour soaking her instantly. Through the curtain of water, she could make out the approaching riders, still some distance. Away through the trees, drawing a deep breath, Eleanor screamed as loudly as she could. "Help! Here, help me!" Behind her, the cabin was rapidly becoming engulfed in flames despite the rain, the dry interior catching quickly. Caldwell and his men emerged, their attention divided between the fire consuming their hideout and their escaping prisoner. Eleanor ran toward the riders, stumbling on the muddy ground, her soaked skirts hampering her movements. She heard the crack of a gun behind her but couldn't stop, even as a bullet whizzed past her head. The approaching riders had heard her cries and increased their pace. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out a familiar figure. At their lead, not Sheriff Mason as she had hoped, but Frank Sullivan, the rancher whose property had been attacked as a diversion. "Miss Blackwood," Sullivan called in disbelief as he reined in his horse. "What in God's name—" "Caldwell," she gasped, gesturing behind her where the cabin now blazed brightly through the rain. "He kidnapped me. His men are armed." As if to confirm her warning, another shot rang out. Sullivan and his companions, his sons and neighboring ranchers, she now realized, immediately drew their own weapons. "Get behind me," Sullivan ordered, pulling Eleanor up onto his horse. To his companions he shouted, "Spread out! Johnson, take Miss Blackwood back to town." The youngest of the riders maneuvered his horse alongside Sullivan's. Before she could be transferred to his mount, however, Hargrove emerged from the trees, firing rapidly. Johnson fell with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The peaceful night erupted into a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Eleanor clung to Sullivan as he wheeled his horse around, seeking cover behind a large boulder. The other ranchers returned fire, forcing Caldwell and his men back toward the burning cabin. "Miss Blackwood," Sullivan said urgently, "can you ride?" "Yes," she replied, though she hadn't been on a horse in years. "Take Johnson's mount," he instructed, cutting her bound hands free with a pocket knife. "Ride for Copper Springs. Find the sheriff. Tell him what's happened here." Eleanor slid from Sullivan's horse and rushed to where Johnson's mount stood nervously nearby, snorting and stamping at the sound of gunfire. The injured young man leaned against a tree, pressing his bandana against his bleeding shoulder. "Go," he urged her. "I'll be fine with my pa and the others." With a silent prayer, Eleanor gathered the reins and pulled herself awkwardly into the saddle, her rain-soaked dress making the task doubly difficult. Once mounted, she oriented herself toward what she hoped was the direction of Copper Springs, and urged the horse forward, leaving the gunfight and burning cabin behind. The rain continued to pour as she rode through the darkness, relying on the horse's instincts more than her own sense of direction. After what seemed like hours, but was likely less than one, the lights of Copper Springs appeared in the distance, a welcome beacon in the stormy night. As she approached the outskirts of town, a rider materialized from the gloom, heading directly toward her. Eleanor tensed, preparing to flee, when the rider called out her name. "Miss Blackwood! Eleanor!" Relief flooded through her at the sound of Sheriff Mason's voice. He galloped to her side, his face etched with concern and exhaustion in the dim light. "Thank God," he breathed, reaching out to steady her as she swayed in the saddle. "I've been searching since I returned and found signs of struggle in your room." "Caldwell," she managed, teeth chattering from cold and shock. "He had me kidnapped. Cabin in the woods. Sullivan and his men. There's a gunfight. They need help." Mason's expression hardened. "Where?" Eleanor described the location as best she could, and Mason nodded grimly. "I'll gather men and go, but first you need medical attention and safety." He took the reins of her horse. "Come, Dr. Anderson returned from Prescott this afternoon. He'll see to you while I organize a post." They rode together into town, the rain finally beginning to slacken. The clock on the church tower showed nearly midnight. Eleanor had been missing for less than 6 hours, though it felt like days had passed since her abduction. Dr. Anderson, roused from sleep, quickly examined Eleanor in his small clinic while Mason gathered trusted men for the ride to Sullivan's aid. The physician pronounced her physically unharmed, aside from minor rope burns on her wrists and the lingering effects of the chloroform. "You're fortunate," he told her, as he applied ointment to her wrists. "Chloroform can be deadly in the wrong dose, and exposed flames in a closed space could have led to an explosion rather than just a fire." Eleanor shuddered at how close she had come to death multiple times that night. "I didn't have time to consider the risks," she admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let Hargrove take me to their second location." "Quick thinking saved your life," Dr. Anderson affirmed, patting her hand paternally, "though the sheriff will have my hide if I don't insist you rest now." As if summoned by his mention, Mason appeared in the doorway, grim determination etched on his face. He'd changed into dry clothing and gathered a group of armed men who waited outside. "How is she?" he asked the doctor. "Remarkably well, considering," Anderson replied, "though she needs rest and warmth." Mason nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Daniels has prepared a room for you at the hotel. It's more secure than your quarters behind the office, and she'll keep watch while I'm gone." "Did you find any evidence in my room?" Eleanor asked. "Caldwell said they took my journal to use in staging my disappearance." "They took more than that," Mason confirmed. "The place was thoroughly searched. Any notes you had about Caldwell's land dealings are gone." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, frustration washing over her. "Then we've lost our documentation of his illegal activities." "Not entirely," Mason said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "They didn't find the hidden compartment where we stored the most incriminating evidence. The original land deeds with the irregular signatures are still secure." This small victory bolstered Eleanor's spirits. "Be careful," she urged, as Mason prepared to leave. "Caldwell is desperate now. He knows we're building a case against him." "I'm always careful," Mason assured her with a gentle smile that softened his weathered features. "And I'm bringing 10 armed men who've all suffered Caldwell's business practices in one form or another. Rest now. When I return, we'll formulate our next move." After Mason departed with his posse, Mrs. Daniels escorted Eleanor to the hotel, fussing over her like a mother hen. The older woman had prepared a hot bath and clean nightclothes, luxuries that seemed impossibly wonderful after the night's ordeal. "The whole town's buzzing," Mrs. Daniels confided as she helped Eleanor into the steaming bath. "Word spread that Caldwell's men took you, and suddenly people are finding their courage, sharing stories they've kept quiet for years out of fear." "What kind of stories?" Eleanor asked, sinking gratefully into the warm water. Threats, property damage, livestock killed, all happening to folks who refused to sell to Caldwell. Things everyone suspected, but no one dared connect to him directly. Mrs. Daniels shook her head. "Your kidnapping was the final straw. Even Reverend Porter, who's been in Caldwell's pocket since he donated the church bells, is questioning his association with the man." This shift in public opinion represented a significant change in Eleanor's and Mason's favor. If townspeople were willing to speak out about their experiences, the circumstantial evidence in the land records could be corroborated by first-hand testimony. Later, wrapped in a warm robe and settled in a comfortable bed, Eleanor found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the moment of her abduction, or heard Caldwell's cold voice discussing her disposal as if she were merely an inconvenient object. More disturbingly, she couldn't stop thinking about what might be happening. At the cabin, had Sullivan and his men prevailed against Caldwell and his outlaws? Had Mason arrived in time to assist them, or had she sent the sheriff riding into a trap? As dawn broke, Eleanor dressed in clothes Mrs. Daniels had borrowed from her niece and went downstairs. The hotel dining room was unusually crowded for the early hour, filled with townspeople exchanging rumors and speculation about the night's events. Conversation quieted as Eleanor entered, all eyes turning to her with expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. Mrs. Daniels hurried over, leading her to a table where breakfast awaited. "Any word from the sheriff?" Eleanor asked quietly. Mrs. Daniels shook her head. "Nothing yet, but travelers arriving this morning reported seeing a large fire in the hills last night, visible for miles, despite the rain." Eleanor was about to reply when the dining room door opened and Sheriff Mason entered. His clothes were mud-splattered, his face haggard from the night's exertions, but his eyes carried a grim satisfaction as they found Eleanor across the room. The entire dining room fell silent as Mason removed his hat and approached her table. Even before he spoke, Eleanor knew from his expression that something significant had occurred, something that would change Copper Springs forever. "Robert Caldwell is dead," Mason announced, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room, "and the full extent of his crimes is about to come to light." A collective gasp rippled through the hotel dining room at Mason's announcement. Robert Caldwell, the wealthiest, most influential man in Copper Springs, was dead. Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that her former fiancé could no longer threaten her, shock at the finality of his demise, and concern about what would follow. "What happened?" she asked as Mason took a seat across from her. The sheriff accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Daniels quickly provided, before addressing not just Eleanor, but the entire room of townspeople hanging on his every word. "When we reached the burning cabin, Sullivan and his men were exchanging fire with Caldwell's gang. During the fight, Caldwell tried to escape on horseback, but was thrown when his mount was startled by falling debris from the cabin. He struck his head on a boulder." Mason's voice remained steady, factual. "Dr. Anderson confirmed there was nothing to be done for him." "And Hargrove?" Eleanor asked, remembering the outlaw who had been tasked with taking her to the secondary location. "Wounded, but alive," Mason replied grimly. "We've got him locked in the jail along with 2 others. They'll stand trial for kidnapping, attempted murder, and various other charges once the circuit judge arrives next week." An older man rose from his table near the window. "What about Caldwell's business interests? His ranch? He owns half the valley now." That's where things get complicated," Mason acknowledged. "With Caldwell's death, all his holdings will transfer according to his will, which is presumably with his lawyers in Denver. I've sent telegrams to notify the proper authorities." Mrs. Daniels leaned closer to Eleanor. "His wife will inherit everything, I expect. Abigail Caldwell could be even worse than Robert if she decides to take an interest in Copper Springs." This possibility hadn't occurred to Eleanor. The threat might have changed form rather than disappeared entirely. Before she could consider the implications further, Mason continued, "What's more immediate is the evidence we recovered from Caldwell's personal papers at the cabin. His journal contains detailed accounts of intimidation tactics, arranged accidents, and payoffs to ensure cooperation." The sheriff's gaze swept across the room. "Many of you suffered these tactics firsthand, but were afraid to speak out. That time for fear is over." A murmur spread through the dining room. People exchanged glances, some ashamed, others defiant. Frank Sullivan, who had entered behind Mason, stepped forward. "The sheriff's right. I lost 30 head of cattle to Caldwell's rustlers, had my fences cut, my water supply tampered with, all because I refused to sell my family's land. I wasn't the only one." He turned to face his neighbors. "We all knew what was happening, but we stayed silent. That silence allowed Caldwell to tighten his grip on Copper Springs." Others began to speak up. The blacksmith whose shop mysteriously caught fire after he supported Mason in the last election, the general store owner who faced sudden supply problems when he extended credit to ranchers resisting Caldwell's offers, the young widow whose deceased husband had refused to sell their modest homestead days before his hunting accident. Tom Jenkins, the livery stable owner, stood up with difficulty, his arthritic hands gripping the edge of his table. 3 years ago, Caldwell offered to buy my stable. When I refused, my best horses disappeared. One by one they vanished from fenced paddocks. No tracks, no broken gates, just gone. Next came mysterious illnesses among the remaining stock. Customers took their business elsewhere, afraid their animals would be next. "How did you survive?" someone asked. Jenkins glanced at the sheriff. "Mason paid premium rates to stable the town horses with me, kept me afloat when no one else would risk it. Eleanor noticed how many stories included similar mentions of Mason's quiet assistance, small acts of resistance against Caldwell's growing power that had allowed people to endure without surrendering completely. Martha Wilson, the seamstress, who had been helping Eleanor with alterations to her Eastern clothes, raised her voice from the corner. "My husband worked as foreman at the Ridgeline mine before Caldwell bought it. When Jack questioned the safety shortcuts Caldwell ordered, he was fired without references. 3 weeks later, the support beams Caldwell refused to replace collapsed. 7 men died." Her voice broke. "Jack would have been among them if Caldwell hadn't made an example of him first." As the stories accumulated, Eleanor realized the full extent of Caldwell's reign of terror over the community. The man she had traveled thousands of miles to marry had systematically crushed anyone who stood in the way of his ambitions. Mason let the testimonies flow, nodding occasionally as new details connected existing evidence. Finally, he raised his hand for attention. "I appreciate your courage in speaking out now. Each of you should come to my office in the next few days to provide formal statements. These testimonies, combined with the documentary evidence Miss Blackwood helped organize, will ensure that justice is served, not just for Caldwell, but for his entire operation." As the gathering dispersed, people stopped to speak with Eleanor, some offering apologies for believing Caldwell's insinuations about her, others expressing admiration for her courage in escaping her captors. By the time the dining room cleared, only Eleanor, Mason, and Mrs. Daniels remained. "You should rest," Mason told Eleanor, concern evident in his voice. "You've been through an ordeal." "I'd rather help compile the statements," Eleanor replied. "There's still work to be done." Mason studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes, despite the exhaustion etched there. "Very well, but first, there's something you should know." He glanced at Mrs. Daniels, who nodded encouragingly. "I found this among Caldwell's papers." He withdrew a folded document from his vest pocket and placed it on the table. Eleanor recognized it immediately, one of Robert Caldwell's letters to her, the one in which he had described his ranch and proposed marriage. "There's more," Mason said, producing several additional pages. "Drafts of the letters he sent you, complete with corrections and annotations from someone else, instructions on what to include, what tone to adopt, how to appear more appealing to an educated Eastern woman." Eleanor scanned the pages, her stomach tightening as she realized the full extent of the deception. The thoughtful, articulate man whose letters had convinced her to travel west had never existed. The correspondence had been crafted specifically to lure her, and presumably the other women before her, to Copper Springs. One notation particularly caught her eye. "Remember, she values intellectual discourse. Reference Shakespeare and Greek classics. Mention your extensive library, even though you've never opened a book without pictures." The contemptuous tone revealed Caldwell's true regard for the very qualities he had pretended to admire in her. "But why," she asked, looking up from the painful evidence, "why go to such lengths to bring me here if he was already married?" "This may answer that question," Mason said, unfolding a final document. "It appears to be a contract between Caldwell and a man named Edward Pinkerton of Denver, dated 8 months ago." Eleanor skimmed the formal language, her confusion growing until she reached a passage that made her blood run cold. "Upon delivery of a suitable female companion for R. Caldwell, possessing adequate education and refinement to serve as social hostess, and bearing legal documentation of East Coast banking connections through family lineage, E. Pinkerton shall receive payment of $1,000 plus expenses." "He wasn't looking for a wife," Eleanor whispered, the pieces falling into place. "He was looking for someone with banking connections. My father's position at First Philadelphia Trust." Mason nodded grimly. "From what we've pieced together, Caldwell's expansion was built on borrowed money, His legitimate lenders were becoming concerned about his ability to repay. He needed access to new financing channels. And he thought I could provide that through my family connections, Eleanor concluded, anger replacing shock. But my father passed away years ago. His position died with him. Caldwell discovered that too late, Mason confirmed. After you arrived and he realized you couldn't provide the financial connections he needed, you became a liability rather than an asset. There's more, Mason continued, unfolding another document. This is a loan agreement with the First Bank of Denver. Caldwell leveraged nearly everything he owned to secure funding for a massive expansion of his holdings, buying out neighboring ranches, investing in the silver mine outside town, even purchasing controlling interest in the freight company that serves this region. Mrs. Daniels peered at the document over Eleanor's shoulder. Those due dates have already passed. He was in default? By nearly 3 months, Mason confirmed. According to his correspondence, the bank was threatening foreclosure. That's why he became increasingly desperate to secure new investors or lenders who might bail him out. The calculated nature of Caldwell's scheme made Eleanor's initial rejection by him appear in an entirely new light. He hadn't rejected her for being too independent. He dismissed her when he discovered she couldn't serve his financial purposes. "There's something else you should see," Mrs. Daniels interjected, reaching into her apron pocket. "This telegram arrived for the sheriff this morning while he was out dealing with everything." Mason read the telegram, his expression darkening before he handed it to Eleanor. "Sheriff N. Mason, Copper Springs, Arizona Territory, Abigail Caldwell, deceased. Stop, died. Denver, typhoid fever. 3 weeks past. Stop, Robert Caldwell, aware of death. Stop, falsely maintaining marriage status. Stop, Denver authorities investigating financial irregularities. Stop, assets frozen pending investigation. Stop, Judge Hollister, Denver Circuit Court." 3 weeks ago, Eleanor gasped. "He wasn't just already married when he corresponded with me. He was a widower, pretending his wife was still alive." "It appears so," Mason confirmed. Maintaining the illusion of his marriage to Abigail probably protected some of his business interests in Denver. Meanwhile, he was attempting to secure you as a replacement connection to Eastern banks. "How did you come to suspect Caldwell in the first place?" Eleanor asked, suddenly curious about the origins of Mason's investigation. The sheriff ran a hand through his hair, fatigue evident in the gesture. "It started with small inconsistencies in land transactions, complaints about intimidation that victims later withdrew, property changing hands after suspicious accidents. Patterns emerged, but Caldwell was careful to maintain plausible deniability. The turning point came last year," he continued. "A young rancher named Michael Collins refused to sell his water rights to Caldwell. A week later, Collins was found dead, supposedly thrown from his horse. But the injuries didn't match that story. I began investigating more aggressively, which made me a target." "Is that why your deputy left for the railroad?" Eleanor asked, remembering what Mrs. Daniels had told her about the position becoming available. Mason's expression darkened. "Williams didn't leave voluntarily. Caldwell's men caught him collecting evidence at the Collins property. They beat him so severely he can barely walk now. The railroad job was the best I could arrange for him, a desk position in Prescott, where Caldwell's reach doesn't extend. This revelation added another layer to Mason's commitment to bringing Caldwell to justice, not just professional duty but personal obligation to his injured deputy. The layers of deception were almost too much to comprehend. Eleanor set down the telegram, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. "You need rest," Mason insisted, seeing her fatigue. "The statements can wait until tomorrow." This time, Eleanor didn't argue. Mrs. Daniels led her back to her room, where she fell into an exhausted sleep almost immediately. She awoke in the late afternoon to the sound of raised voices in the street below. Moving to the window, Eleanor saw a crowd gathering outside the sheriff's office. Mason stood on the steps, his posture tense as he addressed the agitated townspeople. Hastily dressing, Eleanor made her way downstairs and across the street, arriving in time to hear Mason attempting to calm the crowd. "Justice will be served through proper legal channels," he was saying, his voice firm but strained. "The circuit judge will arrive next week." "Next week is too late," someone shouted from the crowd. "Hargrove and those other outlaws deserve to hang now." A chorus of agreement rose from many assembled. Eleanor recognized several men who had suffered under Caldwell's regime. The anger that had been suppressed by fear was now finding dangerous expression. "Stand aside, Sheriff," demanded William Peterson, a rancher whose barn had been burned. "We're taking those men out of your jail. They'll face frontier justice today." Eleanor pushed her way through to Mason's side. "This isn't right," she said, loudly enough for those nearest to hear. "If you do this, you're no better than Caldwell and his men." Peterson turned to her, his face flushed with anger. "With all due respect, Miss Blackwood, you've only been in Copper Springs a few weeks. Some of us have endured Caldwell's tyranny for years. We've earned our vengeance." "What you've earned is justice," Eleanor countered, meeting his gaze steadily. "Not vengeance. There's a difference." "She's right," Mason added, seizing the moment. "Think about what you're doing. Caldwell ruled through fear and disregard for the law. Is that the legacy you want for Copper Springs now that he's gone? A town where mob rule replaces legal authority?" From the back of the crowd, the minister, Reverend Collins, stepped forward. "I remind you all of Proverbs 20:22. Do not say, 'I will repay evil.' Wait for the Lord, and he will help you." We have suffered, yes, but taking the law into our own hands makes us no better than those who wronged us. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but the tension remained palpable. Peterson wasn't ready to back down. "Those men kidnapped Miss Blackwood," he argued. "They shot my neighbor's son. They've rustled our cattle and burned our property for years. They deserve the rope." "Yes, they do," Eleanor agreed, surprising both Peterson and Mason. "But delivered through proper justice, not a lynch mob. I was their victim, yet I'm standing here asking you to wait for the judge." She stepped forward, addressing the crowd more directly. "I came to Copper Springs under false pretenses, lured by Caldwell's lies. Within days, I discovered the truth, not just about him, but about all of you. I saw a town living in fear, people compromising their principles to survive under tyranny." Her voice strengthened as she continued. "Now Caldwell is gone. This is your opportunity to rebuild Copper Springs as it should be, a community founded on justice, not fear. But that rebuilding begins with this moment, with this choice. Will you honor the law, or will you become what you've despised?" From the back of the crowd, Frank Sullivan pushed forward to stand beside Eleanor. "The lady's right," he announced. "My boy took a bullet from these men, but I want to see them tried properly. We start taking the law into our own hands. Where does it end?" Martha Wilson joined them, her weathered face resolute. "After what happened to Jack and the miners, I wanted vengeance more than anyone. But this isn't the way. My husband always said, the law may be slow, but it's the only thing that separates us from animals." One by one, others stepped forward to support Eleanor's position. Tom Jenkins from the livery, Dr. Anderson, Mrs. Daniels, and finally Reverend Collins, forming a human barrier between the angry mob and the jailhouse door. The crowd's momentum faltered as more voices joined Sullivan's. The immediate threat of violence began to dissipate, though resentment still simmered beneath the surface. Mason seized the opportunity. "I understand your frustration. Caldwell and his men have injured all of us in various ways, but we have a chance now to rebuild Copper Springs on a foundation of true justice, not fear or vengeance. Those men will face a judge and jury," he promised. "Their crimes will be answered for. In the meantime, I propose we channel our energy into something constructive, gathering evidence, documenting the damage Caldwell caused, and beginning to repair our community. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. Peterson, still angry but no longer openly defiant, pointed a finger at Mason. 1 week, Sheriff. If the judge isn't here by then, we'll revisit this conversation. As the town square cleared, Mason turned to Eleanor with evident relief. Thank you. That could have turned ugly fast. I spoke the truth, Eleanor replied simply. Violence would only perpetuate the cycle Caldwell created. Not everyone would see it that way after what you experienced, Mason observed. Your words carried weight because you were their victim. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but I think it was more than that. People want to believe in justice. They just need to be reminded of it sometimes, especially after years of seeing justice denied. They retreated to the relative calm of the sheriff's office, where Mason poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the small stove. Hargrove and the others? Eleanor asked. Secure for now, Mason replied, though I'll maintain extra guards until Judge Hollister arrives. They must have heard the crowd, Eleanor observed. Were they afraid? Mason's mouth quivered in a half-smile. Hargrove's too proud to show fear, but the other 2 were visibly relieved when the mob dispersed. They know what frontier justice looks like. Even hardened criminals prefer a formal trial to a lynch mob. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both processing the events of recent days. Eleanor finally spoke the question that had been forming in her mind since reading the telegram. What happens to Caldwell's properties now that both he and his wife are deceased with no apparent heirs? Mason sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Under territorial law, properties with unclear ownership revert to territorial control until legitimate claimants come forward. Essentially, Caldwell's empire is in limbo. And the people who were forced to sell their land through intimidation, Eleanor pressed, do they have any recourse? With sufficient evidence of coercion, yes, Mason confirmed. The testimonies we're gathering, combined with Caldwell's own records, should provide grounds for legal challenges to many of those transactions. It won't be simple, he cautioned. Even with Caldwell dead, the legal tangles could take years to unravel. The banks that financed his purchases have claims, as do any legitimate business partners. Then there are tax considerations, water rights disputes. Which is why your records were so threatening to him, Eleanor realized. You were creating a paper trail that could unravel his entire operation, even after his death. Exactly, Mason nodded. Organized evidence is powerful, something you understood instinctively when you took on the clerk position. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Deputy Collins, who had returned from escorting a prisoner to Prescott the previous day, entered with an urgent expression. Riders approaching from the east, Sheriff, he reported. Looks like Hargrove's remaining men, at least 6, heavily armed. Mason was immediately alert. How far out? Maybe 20 minutes, Collins replied. They're not trying to hide their approach. Seems like they're coming straight for jail. They must have heard about Caldwell and Hargrove, Mason surmised, checking his gun. Coming to break them out, most likely. Or take revenge, Eleanor suggested, a chill running through her at the thought. Mason nodded grimly. Both possibilities concern me. Collins, round up every able man you can find. Position them strategically around the town square. I want shooters on the roof of the general store and the hotel. What about the crowd from earlier? Eleanor asked. Many of them were armed. They might help defend the town. A mob's loyalty shifts with the wind, Mason replied, though he considered her suggestion. Still, Peterson and Sullivan are solid men despite their hot tempers. Collins, find them specifically. Tell them I'm deputizing them temporarily. As Collins hurried to comply, Mason turned to Eleanor. You should take shelter at Dr. Anderson's office. It's the sturdiest building apart from the jail. Eleanor shook her head. I'm staying here. I can load weapons and tend to injuries if necessary. This isn't your fight, Mason argued, though without much conviction. It became my fight when Caldwell lured me here under false pretenses, Eleanor replied firmly. Besides, you may need every pair of hands available. Recognizing the determination in her eyes, Mason nodded reluctantly. Stay behind the desk, away from windows. If shooting starts, get down on the floor immediately. He handed her a shotgun. Only if absolutely necessary, he instructed. It's loaded, but the recoil is powerful. Brace it firmly against your shoulder if you have to use it. Eleanor accepted the weapon, hoping she wouldn't need to test her resolve with actual violence. As a seamstress, she had created beautiful things with her hands. The thought of using them to harm another human being, even in self-defense, was deeply troubling. The next 15 minutes passed in tense preparation. Mason positioned his hastily assembled defenders, sent women and children to shelter, and ensured the prisoners were securely locked down. Eleanor helped load spare revolvers and rifles, moving with a calm efficiency that belied her racing heart. Through the window, she watched the town transform. Shopkeepers closed their shutters, families hurried home, and armed men took positions at Mason's direction. What had been a bustling community just hours before now resembled a fortress preparing for siege. Remember, Mason instructed his impromptu defenders, these men are dangerous, but not invincible. Our advantage is position and numbers, no heroics. Oh, we're protecting the town, not seeking glory? Sullivan nodded grimly, checking his rifle. Never thought I'd be standing with the law against Caldwell's men. Times do change. For the better, we hope, Mason replied. When the riders finally appeared at the far end of Main Street, the town lay eerily silent. 6 men, dusty from hard riding, moved slowly toward the jail in formation, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. Mason stood on the jailhouse steps, his stance relaxed but alert, his right hand resting near his holstered revolver. Eleanor watched from just inside the doorway, both frightened and fascinated by his calm in the face of such danger. The lead rider, a weathered man with a scar across his cheek, halted his horse 20 yards from the jail. His companions spread out slightly behind him, their eyes scanning the apparently deserted street with professional wariness. "Sheriff Mason," the scarred man called, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "I'm James Lynch. I believe you're holding some friends of mine." "I'm holding 3 men on charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and various other crimes," Mason replied evenly. "If they're your friends, you keep poor company, Mr. Lynch." Lynch's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "We've come to collect them. Simple as that. No need for this to get messy." "That's not going to happen," Mason stated, his voice firm but without aggression. "Your friends will face justice before a judge, as the law requires." Lynch surveyed the empty street with obvious skepticism. "You and what army, Sheriff?" "Caldwell's dead, but his operation continues. You're looking at the new management." "I see 6 men who haven't yet committed a crime in my jurisdiction," Mason replied. "You can keep it that way by turning around and riding out. Or," Lynch countered, his scarred face twisting into a sneer, "we could burn this miserable town to the ground, starting with your jail. How many innocent folks are you willing to sacrifice for 3 prisoners?" "That's not a choice you get to." "Force on me," Mason answered steadily. "This town has suffered enough under Caldwell's tyranny. The people won't bow to threats anymore." As if to emphasize his point, Peterson and 2 other ranchers stepped into view from behind the general store, rifles trained on Lynch and his men. Simultaneously, Sullivan and his sons appeared from the alley beside the hotel, similarly armed. Lynch's confident expression faltered slightly as he realized the trap he'd ridden into. "Seems you've organized a welcoming committee, Sheriff." "Last chance, Lynch," Mason warned. "Ride away now, and you ride away alive." A tense silence followed as Lynch considered the sheriff's words. Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the risk against the loyalty he felt toward his captured companions. The standoff might have remained a battle of wills, if not for a sudden movement from one of Lynch's men, a young, nervous-looking rider who mistook a tumbling tumbleweed for a threat and raised his rifle. Mason drew and fired in one fluid motion, the bullet striking the young man's shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. In the next instant, the street erupted in gunfire as Mason's hidden defenders opened fire from rooftops and windows. Lynch and his men, caught in the open, dove from their horses seeking cover that wasn't there. Two fell immediately under the concentrated fire. Lynch himself made it to the water trough in front of the saloon, returning fire with grim determination. Eleanor pressed herself against the interior wall of the sheriff's office, heart pounding as bullets splintered the wooden doorframe. Through the window, she could see Mason crouched behind a barrel on the porch, exchanging shots with Lynch. The gunfight seemed to last forever, but was over in less than a minute. When the echoes of the final shots faded, 4 of Lynch's men lay, dead or seriously wounded, in the street. The 5th had surrendered, hands raised high above his head. Lynch himself was pinned down, bleeding from a wound in his side, but still dangerous, his revolver aimed steadily at Mason's position. "It's over, Lynch," Mason called. "Drop your weapon and you'll receive medical treatment and a fair trial." "Fair trial," Lynch spat. "Like Hargrove's getting, we both know how that ends." "That's for a judge and jury to decide," Mason replied. "Not you, not me." A tense silence fell as Lynch considered his options. Eleanor could see the desperation in his posture, the calculation of a man with nothing to lose. In that moment, she realized he wasn't going to surrender. He was going to make one final, suicidal attack. "Sheriff!" she called in warning. Just as Lynch burst from cover, firing wildly as he charged toward Mason. Mason rose to meet the threat, his own weapon leveled. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Lynch staggered, a red stain blossoming on his chest, then crumpled to the dusty street. But his final bullet had found its mark as well. Mason fell back against the jailhouse wall, clutching his left shoulder. Eleanor rushed to him, heedless of potential danger. Blood seeped between Mason's fingers as he maintained pressure on the wound. Not fatal, he managed through gritted teeth, just painful. Around them, the town came back to life as people emerged from hiding. Dr. Anderson hurried toward them, his medical bag in hand, while others secured the surviving outlaws and tended to the wounded. As the doctor examined Mason's shoulder, Eleanor surveyed the aftermath of the brief but violent confrontation. The showdown had lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it had permanently altered the future of Copper Springs. With Caldwell dead, and now his remaining men defeated, the town could finally emerge from the shadow of corruption and fear that had defined it for years. Mason winced as Dr. Anderson probed his wound. "Bullet went clean through," the doctor announced. "You're lucky, Sheriff." "Doesn't feel like luck," Mason grunted, then looked up at Eleanor. "But having you here to warn me about Lynch's final move, that was fortunate indeed." Their eyes met, and in that moment of shared survival, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of a connection that had been building since her first day in his office, now crystallized by fire and danger. "We make a good team," Eleanor said softly, helping him to his feet. "Better than you and Caldwell would have," Mason replied with a pained smile. As Dr. Anderson led them toward his clinic for proper treatment, Eleanor reflected on the bizarre twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled west seeking security and marriage, only to find it in the most unexpected place, standing beside a wounded sheriff in the aftermath of a gunfight, feeling more alive and purposeful than she ever had in Philadelphia. Behind them, The townspeople began the process of reclaiming their community, tending the wounded, securing prisoners, and already sharing stories of the battle that would undoubtedly grow more dramatic with each retelling. For the first time since her arrival, Eleanor felt truly part of Copper Springs, not as an outsider or a victim, but as someone who had helped defend its future. And as Sheriff Mason's hand found hers during their walk to the doctor's office, she realized that future might hold possibilities she had never imagined when she first stepped off the stagecoach just weeks before. The week following the shootout passed in a flurry of activity for Copper Springs. With Caldwell's criminal empire dismantled and his remaining men either dead or imprisoned, the town began the complex process of healing and rebuilding. For Eleanor, these days were filled with organizing statements from townspeople detailing years of intimidation and corruption, creating the comprehensive record that would ensure justice when Judge Hollister arrived. Sheriff Mason, his arm, in a sling, but otherwise recovering well from his wound, threw himself back into work despite Dr. Anderson's protests. Each evening, he and Eleanor would review the day's testimonies together, their professional collaboration gradually evolving into something deeper as they shared quiet conversations over coffee long after the office should have closed. On a crisp, autumn morning exactly 7 days after the confrontation with Lynch, the stagecoach arrived carrying Judge Samuel Hollister, a formidable figure with steel-grey hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. He wasted no time establishing his authority, setting up court in the town hall and scheduling hearings to begin the following day. "Miss Blackwood," the judge greeted Eleanor when Mason introduced them. "I've heard remarkable things about your organizational skills. The documentation you've assembled will be invaluable to these proceedings." "Thank you, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. "Sheriff Mason deserves equal credit. He's been investigating Caldwell's activities for years, often at great personal risk." The judge nodded, his shrewd gaze moving between them. "Yes, I can see you. Make an effective team." Something in his tone suggested he recognized more than just their professional alliance, but he tactfully changed the subject. "Now, I understand you were initially brought to Copper Springs under false pretenses as Caldwell's mail-order bride." "Yes, sir," Eleanor confirmed, maintaining her composure despite the still painful deception. "Though I discovered his true nature quickly enough." "Indeed," Hollister said. "I'd like your formal testimony about the kidnapping and your experiences with Caldwell. It will help establish a pattern of criminal behavior that extends beyond local property disputes." The following morning, the town hall was packed as the proceedings began. Nearly every resident of Copper Springs had crowded into the modest building, eager to witness justice being served after years of oppression. Judge Hollister, commanding the makeshift courtroom from behind a simple oak desk, called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "This special session of the Territorial Circuit Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "We have serious matters before us: kidnapping, attempted murder, extortion, fraud, and various other crimes attributed to Robert Caldwell and his associates." He paused, surveying the assembly. "Though Caldwell himself has met his end, justice requires that his crimes be formally documented and that his accomplices face appropriate consequences. We begin today with testimony regarding the most recent offenses, specifically the kidnapping of Miss Eleanor Blackwood." Eleanor approached the witness stand, acutely aware of the eyes following her. Some curious, others supportive, a few still skeptical. She had dressed carefully in her most professional attire, a navy blue dress with modest white trim that conveyed both dignity and seriousness. After being sworn in, she recounted her experiences clearly and precisely, from Caldwell's initial deception in his letters to the terrifying abduction from her quarters and her dramatic escape from the burning cabin. She identified Daniel Hargrove and the other surviving kidnappers, who sat in chains under heavy guard at the side of the room. When she described setting fire to the cabin to create a diversion, murmurs of admiration rippled through the audience. Judge Hollister himself seemed impressed by her resourcefulness under pressure. "Miss Blackwood," he said when she concluded her testimony, "you've demonstrated remarkable courage and presence of mind throughout this ordeal. The court commends you." As Eleanor returned to her seat, Mason caught her eye from across the room, his expression conveying pride and something more personal that brought warmth to her cheeks. The proceedings continued with testimonies from Sullivan, Peterson, and other ranchers who had resisted Caldwell's pressure tactics. Martha Wilson recounted her husband's dismissal from the mine and the subsequent deaths that could have been prevented. Tom Jenkins described the systematic destruction of his livery business. One by one, the citizens of Copper Springs reclaimed their voices, transforming years of private suffering into public record. By late afternoon, the accumulated evidence against Caldwell's organization was overwhelming. Judge Hollister turned his attention to the surviving perpetrators. Daniel Hargrove, he addressed the outlaw, who maintained a defiant posture despite his shackles. "You stand accused of kidnapping, attempted murder, cattle rustling, intimidation, and various other crimes as Robert Caldwell's primary enforcer. How do you plead?" Hargrove spat on the floor. "Not guilty. I was following orders. Caldwell was the mastermind." "Following orders is not a defense recognized by this court," Hollister replied sternly. "Each man is responsible for his own actions under the law." The trial continued for 3 more days, with additional witnesses, documentary evidence, and legal arguments. Throughout, Eleanor maintained her composure, even when facing hostile cross-examination from the court-appointed defender representing Hargrove and his associates. On the 4th day, Judge Hollister delivered his verdicts. Hargrove received 20 years of hard labor for his central role in Caldwell's operation. The other surviving men received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their involvement. More significantly, the judge ordered a comprehensive review of all land transactions conducted under Caldwell's influence, with specific provisions for restoring property to those who had been coerced into selling. This court recognizes that justice in this matter extends beyond punishing the guilty, Hollister stated. It must also, whenever possible, restore what was wrongfully taken. To that end, I am appointing Sheriff Mason and Miss Blackwood as special administrators to oversee the review process, with regular reports to the Territorial Governor's office. This unexpected appointment caused a stir in the courtroom. Eleanor caught Mason's equally surprised expression across the room. The judge continued, "Their demonstrated integrity and thorough knowledge of the relevant documents make them uniquely qualified for this responsibility." As the court adjourned, townspeople surrounded Eleanor and Mason, offering congratulations and support for their new role. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the tension of the previous week. Relief and optimism had replaced fear and resignation. "You've given us back our town," Sullivan told them, his weathered hand gripping Mason's in a firm handshake. "About time someone stood up to those vultures." Martha Wilson embraced Eleanor warmly. "I never thought I'd see justice for Jack," she whispered. "Thank you." Later that evening, Eleanor and Mason sat on the sheriff's office porch, watching the sunset paint Copper Springs in gold and amber. The town seemed different somehow. Buildings that had appeared worn and defeated now stood with quiet dignity in the fading light. "Judge Hollister certainly complicated our lives," Mason observed, adjusting his sling with a wince. "Reviewing all those transactions will take months." "At least 6 months by my calculation," Eleanor agreed. "Maybe longer if disputes arise." A comfortable silence fell between them as they contemplated this shared future. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice unusually hesitant. "Does that timeline present a problem for you?" I understand you might have plans to return east now that the danger has passed. Eleanor considered this question carefully. When she'd first arrived in Copper Springs, returning to Philadelphia had seemed the only logical goal once she realized. Robert Caldwell wasn't the man his letters had portrayed. Yet now, the thought of leaving stirred an unexpected sadness. I have nothing waiting for me in Philadelphia, she said honestly. My position at the dressmaker's has surely been filled, my apartment rented to someone else. Here, at least, I have meaningful work and— She paused, suddenly shy. Friendships I've come to value. Mason turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. Is friendship all you feel, Eleanor? The directness of his question caught her off guard, though she had sensed this conversation approaching for days. In Philadelphia, such personal declarations would have been preceded by months of formal courtship. But the frontier operated by different rules. Life was more precarious, making people more direct about matters of the heart. No, she admitted softly. Not just friendship. Mason reached across the space between them to take her hand. These past weeks have been the most challenging of my life, but also the most rewarding, largely because of you. Your courage, your intelligence, your willingness to fight for what's right. I've never met anyone like you, Eleanor. Nathaniel, she responded, using his given name for the first time. I came to Arizona Territory seeking a husband, only to discover the man whose letters had won my heart was a fraud. I never expected to find someone genuine amid such deception. I'm as genuine as they come, Mason said with a self-deprecating smile. Too straightforward for most women's tastes, I'm told. I've had enough of artifice and pretty words, Eleanor replied, thinking of Caldwell's carefully crafted letters. I prefer honesty, even when it's unvarnished. Mason's thumb traced gentle patterns on her palm, sending a warmth through her arm that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. In the spirit of honesty, then, I care for you deeply, Eleanor, more than I thought possible after knowing someone for such a short time. When this is all settled, when Copper Springs has found its footing again, would you consider a more permanent arrangement between us? The question hung in the air, not unexpected, yet still momentous. Eleanor thought of the strange path that had brought her to this moment, answering an advertisement from a man who had seen her only as a means to an end, then finding genuine connection with another who valued her precisely for the qualities Caldwell had found threatening. I would consider it, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. But I have conditions. Mason raised an eyebrow, waiting. I won't be merely a wife, Eleanor continued. I've discovered I have skills that contribute to this community. Organization, attention to detail, a talent for bringing order to chaos. Whatever our personal arrangement, I want to continue using those abilities. A slow smile spread across Mason's face. I wouldn't have it any other way. Copper Springs needs your talents as much as I need your companionship. The town clerk position could become permanent with appropriate compensation. A working wife might raise eyebrows, Eleanor warned, though she was smiling too. Let them raise, Mason replied with a shrug that made him wince as it pulled his injured shoulder. This town has survived far worse than a bit of gossip about progressive marital arrangements. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Judge Hollister, who'd apparently been taking an evening constitutional tour around the town square. Sheriff Miss Blackwood, he greeted them, tipping his hat. I hope I'm not intruding on a private moment. Not at all, Your Honor, Mason replied, though he didn't release Eleanor's hand. We were just discussing the future administration of Copper Springs. The judge's eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. I'm sure you were. Actually, I'm glad to find you together. There's a matter I wanted to discuss before I depart tomorrow. He settled onto a nearby chair, arranging his coattails with judicial precision. The territorial governor is quite concerned about the situation here, not just Caldwell's crimes, but the power vacuum his death has created. He's considering establishing Copper Springs as a proper incorporated town with an elected mayor and council. That would be a significant change, Mason observed. Currently, we're just an unincorporated settlement under territorial authority. Indeed, the judge agreed, and such a transition requires leadership from individuals with both integrity and vision. He fixed Mason with a pointed look. The governor has suggested you would make an excellent candidate for the first mayoral election. Sheriff, Mason looked genuinely startled. Me? I'm a lawman, not a politician. The best leaders often begin as reluctant ones, Hollister replied. You've already demonstrated your commitment to this community and your willingness to stand against corruption, even at personal risk. Those are precisely the qualities needed during this transition. What about my sheriff's duties? Mason asked, clearly considering the possibility despite his initial surprise. A formally incorporated town could appoint a new sheriff, perhaps your deputy Collins, with some additional training. The judge turned his attention to Eleanor. And the town would need a proper clerk to manage the expanded administrative responsibilities, someone with organizational skills and attention to detail. Eleanor recognized the deliberate parallel to her earlier conversation with Mason. That position would interest me greatly, Your Honor. I thought it might, Hollister said with satisfaction. The governor values capable administrators, regardless of gender. He specifically mentioned that your work organizing evidence for this trial impressed him considerably. The judge rose, preparing to take his leave. Nothing needs to be decided tonight. The incorporation process would take several months at minimum, but I wanted to plant the seed before departing. He paused, his expression becoming more personal. Copper Springs stands at a crossroads. It needs good people to guide its future development. After the judge had continued on his way, Eleanor and Mason sat in thoughtful silence, processing this unexpected possibility. Mayor Mason, Eleanor finally said, testing the title. It has a certain dignified ring to it. Town Clerk Blackwood, Mason countered with a smile. Or would it be Town Clerk Mason, eventually? The question, casually posed but profoundly significant, hung between them. Eleanor felt a surge of emotion as she considered the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate mail-order bride to respected professional with prospects both personal and civic that exceeded anything she might have imagined in Philadelphia. Either would be an honor, she replied softly, though we should perhaps take Judge Hollister's advice and not decide everything tonight. Mason nodded, understanding her need for time, despite his evident happiness at her response. We have months of work ahead sorting out Caldwell's legal tangles, plenty of time to consider future arrangements. As darkness settled fully over Copper Springs, they remained on the porch, their hands still joined, discussing possibilities for the town's future that gradually intertwined with possibilities for their own. The stagecoach that had brought Eleanor west now seemed like a conveyance of fate rather than mere transportation, delivering her not to the false promise she had expected, but to an authentic opportunity she could never have anticipated. 6 months later, as autumn's golden light once again painted Copper Springs, the town gathered to celebrate two significant events: its formal incorporation as a recognized settlement with elected leadership and the marriage of its first mayor to its highly efficient town clerk. The ceremony, performed by Judge Hollister, who had returned specifically for the occasion, took place on the steps of the newly constructed town hall. Eleanor wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had designed and sewn herself, adorned with delicate embroidery that showcased the needlework skills from her former profession. Dearly beloved, Hollister began, his judicial voice carrying across. The assembled townspeople, we gather to witness the union of two individuals whose partnership began in crisis but flourished in peace. Their commitment to each other mirrors their commitment to this community, founded on honesty, mutual respect, and shared purpose. As Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged their vows, she marveled at the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. The letters that had lured her west had been works of fiction, crafted to deceive. Yet the deception had led to truth, the danger to security, the uncertainty to purpose. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Hollister declared. Then, with a smile that softened his normally stern countenance, he added, "And may I be the first to formally address you as Mayor and Mrs. Mason of Copper Springs." The town erupted in cheers as Nathaniel kissed his bride, the celebration marking not just a marriage, but a community's rebirth, where Robert Caldwell had sought to build an empire. Through intimidation and fraud, Eleanor and Nathaniel would help nurture a town founded on justice and opportunity. As they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, Eleanor caught sight of the stagecoach arriving with new passengers. Perhaps among them, another hopeful soul seeking a fresh start in the West. She squeezed Nathaniel's hand, appreciating how unexpected life's journeys could be. She had traveled to Arizona territory as a mail-order bride for an outlaw, only to find protection, purpose, and love with the sheriff who had opposed him. In Copper Springs, she had discovered not just a husband, but a home and a calling, proving that sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive in packages far different than we expect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.